Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Chapter 14, February to March, 1932.
Events in the Southern Pacific must now be noticed. Captain Appleton's instructions included certain confidential references to the projected expedition to the South Sea Islands, for which his force was intended to pave the way. He had under his command, in addition to the new cruisers Albany and Columbia, the aircraft carrier Wright and 18 destroyers. He was ordered to take every precaution to avoid rousing Japanese suspicions as to the ultimate object of his movements, and to make sure that no regular patrol of the area to the east of Truk was being carried out by the enemy. Compared with this, the attack upon Japanese trade with Australia was to be regarded as a secondary consideration, to be dealt with when convenient. At the same time, it would furnish a plausible explanation of movements which might otherwise set the enemy thinking. Strangely enough, these orders coincided with a Japanese plan for seizing the American possessions in the Samoa Group. In Tokyo, it had been suggested that the most effective way of preventing the U.S. Navy from carrying out its rumored intention of attacking the important Australian trade was to occupy Tutuila, the only position capable of being used as a base for such attack. A small expedition had been fitted out, comprising in all some 5,000 troops, mainly Kobe, reservist infantry. These, with artillery and munitions, were accommodated in 10 transports, ships of moderate size whose average speed fell below 11 knots. They were convoyed by a squadron made up of the 4 obsolete cruisers, Awate, flagship of Rear Admiral Kuruma, Idzumo, Yakumo, and Azuma, with 10 second-class destroyers. The cruisers were all over 30 years old and had long been relegated to subsidiary duties, but for an expedition of this kind, they were quite useful ships. A couple of scouting seaplanes had been added to the equipment of each, and they had been otherwise modernized to a certain extent. Each was armed with 4 8-inch and 8 6-inch guns. The destroyers were old 30-knotters of some 600 tons apiece. The expedition assembled at Jaluit during the last week in February. It was time to reach Tutuila at daybreak on March 5th, when a landing, so the Japanese thought, could be effected without difficulty, having regard to the advantage of surprise and the absence of a strong garrison. Nor was there any reason why this program should not have been carried through with complete success, but for the coincidence of Captain Appleton's mission in the same waters. On arriving at Tutuila, that officer was employed for some days in arranging for the reception of the troops to be dispatched from Hawaii as part of the Truk expedition. It had been decided to place most of the soldiers under canvas, and campsites had to be selected within easy reach of water supplies. Although the area of Tutuila is only 40 square miles, this task kept Captain Appleton occupied for nearly a week in consultation with the governor, who was also a naval officer. During this time, the Albany, Wright, and 2 divisions of destroyers remained at Pago Pago. The Columbia, Captain Parker, and the remaining 6 destroyers, having refueled, were directed to cruise on a line to the northwestward. On March 1st, the Columbia ran upon an uncharted shoal some 200 miles north of the island of Rotuma. She appeared to have scraped over a ridge of coral, upon which her after part still rested. Destroyers attempted to tow her clear, while her own engines worked at full speed, but no appreciable movement resulted. An inspection by divers showed the vessel to be firmly wedged between 2 masses of coral. It was then decided to lighten her by pumping 500 tons of oil, fuel, and water from her after tanks. This having been done, a second attempt was made to tow her off, but again without success. As night had now fallen, operations had to be suspended. In the meantime, Captain Appleton, advised by radio of the Columbia's plight, had ordered the Wright to proceed to her assistance, he himself intending to follow next day with the Albany and his remaining destroyers. At daybreak, renewed efforts were made to drag the Columbia off the shoal, and at length, after hours of strenuous labor, she floated clear. But the damage she had sustained proved to be very extensive. Portions of the keel had been torn away, and all 4 propellers were injured. It was at this juncture that 2 airplanes were observed coming from the northwest, and a machine from the Columbia, going up to investigate, sighted a squadron of enemy warships, convoying a number of merchant steamers. Closer scrutiny showed the hostile force to consist of a destroyer flotilla and the Iwate, Idzumo, Yakumo, and Azuma, old cruisers averaging 9,600 tons. Their speed was low, but they had good armor protection, and their batteries of 8-inch and 6-inch guns, though of obsolete models, were likely to prove formidable in close action. The Columbia, being a ship of much later design, had a more powerful battery of 8-inch high-velocity guns, but she was practically destitute of armor protection. True, her big guns were fitted with splinter-proof shields, but these afforded little or no real shelter to the crews. And more often than not, they merely served to detonate shells, which might otherwise have passed through without exploding. These drawbacks notwithstanding, Captain Parker would have had small cause for anxiety if his ship had been good for her original speed of 33 knots or more, for he would then have been able to fight at his selected range, or alternatively to avoid action altogether. As things were, however, the crippled cruiser could barely travel at half her designed speed. It was therefore with a full knowledge of his dangerous situation that Captain Parker ordered his destroyers to leave him and try to make contact with Captain Appleton's squadron, which was known to be on the way from Pago Pago. The Japanese squadron, leaving several destroyers to guard the convoy, now approached the Columbia at full speed. In order to make the most of his initial advantage in range, Captain Parker stood towards the eastward at his best speed, while the Japanese, changing their formation from line ahead to line abreast as the range shortened, were soon able to bring their forward 8-inch guns to bear. In the meantime, the Columbia had endeavored to knock out the leading Japanese ship before her low-powered guns could get into action. Despite a smoke screen thrown across the course of the advancing enemy cruisers by their attendant destroyers, which were steaming some distance to windward, the concentrated fire of the Columbia's heavy guns did a considerable amount of damage to the Azuma. One shell penetrated her deck and ignited a quantity of ammunition which had been brought up in readiness for closer action. The explosion and fire which followed put the Azuma practically out of action until she had repaired damages. She dropped astern and did not appear again until the fight was nearly over. But her consorts were now beginning to find the range, though for some time their practice was poor, probably because these ships were manned largely by elderly reservists and youths fresh from the training establishments. As they overhauled the Columbia, their 6-inch batteries were also brought into play. Still, for some time the Columbia contrived to hold her own, thanks to her superior fire control gear and more powerful guns. Unfortunately, this advantage was largely negatived by the Japanese airplanes, which by reporting the fall of each salvo enabled their ships to develop a most accurate fire, until the Columbia was being smothered with shell. She was soon in a deplorable state. Half her guns were out of action, and the crews of those still intact had been renewed more than once, so that she was no longer able to maintain a rapid or an accurate fire. In spite of all efforts to localize outbreaks, fires were raging at 3 points, and casualties had become so numerous that the medical staff could no longer cope with them. Some of the wounded, who had to be left where they fell, suffered a cruel death in the flames, for their comrades engaged in fighting the fires were either unaware of their plight or unable to reach them. Captain Parker and several of his officers had been killed early in the battle by a salvo from the Iwate, which wrecked the bridge and brought down the foremast and a funnel. Lieutenant Commander Isaacs, the senior officer surviving, continued to fight the ship from a less exposed position until he in turn fell, badly wounded by a splinter. In fear that some unauthorized person might offer to surrender before the ship sank, for it had been reported to him that she was leaking badly from hits on the waterline and that the pumps could scarcely hold the water, he had given directions for the seacocks to be opened. But the matter was taken out of his hands by the Japanese admiral, who, observing the Columbia's fire to have slackened and her manifest state of distress, promptly signaled his destroyers to attack. To supplement their efforts, and at the same time to distract the attention of the American gunners, the 8 airplanes, which had hitherto been on spotting duty, were also launched against the unhappy Columbia. A considerable number of bombs fell around her, but only 4 found the target, and these were too small to inflict serious damage, though they caused further casualties. But the doomed ship could still make her teeth felt, and she received the attacking destroyers with a slow but well-aimed fire. One shell exploded in the boiler room of the Tachibana, putting her out of action and causing the only deaths which occurred on the Japanese side during this phase of the action. This, however, was the Columbia's expiring effort. At least 4 torpedoes appeared to have struck her, and before the second division of destroyers came within range, it was apparent that she was about to founder. Rear Admiral Kuruma now signaled orders to cease fire and sent his destroyers to close the sinking vessel. All her boats were smashed, and but for the timely help rendered by the enemy, there would have been few survivors. As it was, the Japanese entered into the task of saving life with as much zeal as they had previously displayed in fighting, and the majority of those Americans left alive were rescued before the cruiser took her last plunge. Rear Admiral Kuruma, in pursuance of his orders, continued his voyage to Samoa as soon as he had repaired damages. The Tachibana, which was the only ship in serious case, was taken in tow by a transport. When the squadron was sighted next day by the scouting seaplanes of the right, and it was apparent that another fight was impending, everything of value was removed from the crippled destroyer, her crew were distributed amongst the rest of the Japanese ships, and she was scuttled. The battle that followed will long be remembered as a masterly example of sound tactics on the part of the American leader. Before closing with the enemy, Captain Appleton had resolved to secure command of the air, for which purpose he concentrated his whole flying force, 2 seaplanes from the Albany and 12 from the right, upon the Japanese machines. These were all accounted for after a gallant fight, though not until they had shot down 2 of the American planes. This much accomplished, Captain Appleton proceeded to hang on the flank of the Japanese squadron, pounding away methodically with his 8-inch guns. His speed advantage of about 15 knots enabled him to evade with ease all the enemy's efforts to close the range, and Admiral Kuruma found himself in the trying position of being hit continually without being able to touch his opponent. Captain Appleton's tactics were to train 3 of his guns upon each of the Japanese cruisers, thus keeping the whole squadron under a distant but accurate fire, for his spotting aircraft were able to do their work without the least interference. Stoically enduring his punishment in the hope that some lucky chance would give him relief, the Japanese admiral refrained from useless endeavors to get to grips with his elusive adversary, and held doggedly on his course eastward, keeping his warships between the Albany and the transports. Had nightfall been nearer, he might yet have won through, but as it was, his position soon became desperate. Turn and twist as he might, he could not for long avoid the regular salvos of the American cruiser, nor did the smokescreen put up by his destroyers have the desired result. In no long time, all 4 of the Japanese cruisers began to feel the effect of this relentless hammering. Moreover, at this stage of the action, Admiral Kuruma was confronted by a new peril, for he noticed that the American destroyers were working round his flank to get within range of the transports. To counter this threat, he ordered his own boats to attack the American flotilla, which was considerably the stronger, and in the ensuing melee, the Japanese destroyers would have been wiped out had not Kuruma led his cruisers to the rescue. While 2 of the Japanese boats were crippled in this first brush, the Americans did not suffer to anything like the same extent, since in conformity with orders, they broke off the conflict immediately the hostile cruisers joined in. In the course of this fighting, one of the transports was hit by a torpedo, an incident that added to Admiral Kuruma's embarrassments. These were crowding upon him thick and fast, for while his attention had been engaged with the saving of his destroyers, the Albany had so altered her position that the transports now bore the brunt of her fire for several minutes. Heavy casualties were suffered by these ships, their decks being crowded with Japanese soldiers who were watching the fight. And 2 of the transports received structural injuries which caused them to leak, thus further reducing the speed of the squadron. Having sent destroyers alongside the damaged ships, Admiral Kuruma circled round the convoy with his 4 cruisers, thereby laying himself open to further heavy punishment, as this close grouping of the Japanese ships afforded the Albany a better target than ever. The Azuma and Idzumo both began to show signs of distress, the former being on fire forward and the latter having lost her middle funnel. And the climax was reached when the Yakumo was suddenly enveloped in black smoke, while the report of a heavy explosion echoed over the sea. When the smoke cleared, it could be seen that she had broken in two, evidently as the result of a magazine exploding. The flagship Iwate was now the only ship intact, but it was not long before her military mainmast, unsupported by any tripod, fell across the stern, jamming her helm and causing her to describe wild circles in the direction of the transports. At this moment, the U.S. destroyers again rushed in to attack. 2 were sunk by gunfire, but they did not retreat until all the Japanese destroyers had been accounted for, while the Iwate herself received a torpedo which brought her to a standstill with a heavy list. Captain Appleton now began methodically to close the enemy, and as the range shortened, the American fire increased in accuracy. To this murderous cannonade, the Idzumo replied with little effect, for the smoke from the burning Azuma blinded her gunners and obscured their target. True to the fine traditions of the Imperial Japanese Navy, even the Iwate, though obviously sinking, kept several of her guns in action, and one of the shells from this ship inflicted the only serious damage that the Albany received, a hit that penetrated the hull forward, causing many casualties and starting a leak which could not be mastered until the fight was over. But the succession of salvos which now struck the Idzumo speedily silenced her. In a few minutes she, too, was burning fiercely, whereupon the destroyers were again ordered to attack. Game to the last, the Japanese cruisers received these assailants with a fire that sent another of them to the bottom, but by the time the remaining boats had emptied their tubes, the Idzumo and Azuma had both been torpedoed, and were no longer capable of offering serious resistance. Since the Japanese, on being summoned to surrender, still remained defiant, all that could be done was to pick up the survivors from the Idzumo, which soon foundered, and from the Azuma, which ship was now blazing from forecastle to mainmast, so that many of her crew were obliged to drop overboard to escape the flames. Eventually she blew up, leaving only the Iwate afloat. The Japanese flagship was now in such a position that no boats could have been launched from her port side, even if any had remained intact, and only one had been got out to starboard, where the water was nearly level with the rail. The admiral's flag still flew from her foremast, but Captain Appleton dispatched his boats to her in the assurance that she could do no harm, even if she desired to repulse them. They arrived only just in time, for with a final lurch the Iwate went down, taking with her a large number of wounded. Quite 400 were rescued, however, including Rear Admiral Kuruma, who was injured in the arm. He was very much downcast at his defeat, and expressed a wish that he had not survived, but it is difficult to see how he could have done more in the circumstances in which he was placed. There remained to be solved the problem of dealing with the transports. The torpedoed ship was sinking, and the Wright, which, owing to her low speed, had only just arrived on the scene, was ordered to take her in tow. The troops from the sinking vessel having been transferred to her consorts, all but 2 of these were induced, with the assistance of Admiral Kuruma, who went on board each ship to point out the futility of useless resistance, to haul down their flags and relinquish control to American naval officers. The remaining 2 were obdurate, and fearing that night would give them a chance to escape, Captain Appleton ordered them to be torpedoed, first warning them to have all available life-saving appliances in readiness. It was afterwards learned that this useless resistance was due to the fanaticism of certain military officers on board, who threatened to kill anyone hoisting a white flag or showing other signs of submission. In spite of all the humane efforts of the Americans, the sinking of these 2 transports entailed heavy loss of life. The 7 troop ships that remained were taken to Pago Pago, all soldiers being confined below under strict guard until arrangements could be made to transfer them in batches to the United States. In the meantime, their presence caused not a little anxiety to the governor of Tutuila, who realized that these thousands of prisoners would soon overrun the island if they succeeded in breaking loose and getting ashore. All arms except those actually in use by the Marine Guard were placed temporarily on board the warships, so that if the worst occurred, the prisoners would be able to offer no serious resistance. The results of the Battle of Rotuma, as it is officially called from the name of the nearest inhabited land, may be summed up thus. Japanese losses: cruisers Iwate, Idzumo, Azuma, Yakumo, destroyers 10, transports 10. American losses: cruiser Columbia, destroyers 5. On both sides, the loss of life was heavy. In the case of the Japanese squadron, including the transports, it is believed to have been nearly 8,000. On the American side, upwards of 700 lives were lost, mainly in the Columbia and the destroyer flotilla. As a victory, it was complete, and being the first unmistakable advantage gained by the United States in the struggle, there was no likelihood of its importance being minimized. Captain Appleton, who at the outset of the war had resigned his post as Assistant Chief of Naval Operations, rather than accept responsibility for a situation against which he had vainly protested, now found himself the hero of the hour. With characteristic modesty, he contented himself with acknowledging the messages of commendation which reached him, and requesting that he might be permitted to continue his mission with the aid of another cruiser to replace the Columbia. He was gratified to learn that in response to this request, 3 more cruisers were being placed under his orders. These were the Troy, a sister to the Albany, the Memphis, and the Milwaukee, the 2 latter being of the 7,500-ton Omaha type. 2 fresh divisions of destroyers, to replace those sunk or injured in the Battle of Rotuma, were also sent out. At the same time, he was informed that he had been specially promoted to the rank of Rear Admiral, irrespective of the ordinary rules regarding seniority. It is probable that his was the most popular promotion ever made in the history of the United States Navy, and the government undoubtedly gained in public favor by their disregard of precedent in giving this gallant officer such well-merited advancement.
This concludes today's reading of The Great Pacific War by Hector Bywater, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also tomorrow for the next chapter, or download the complete audiobook from our webshop at www.payhip.com/Antonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.